The 2023 film Oppenheimer stars Cillian Murphy playing Julius Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb who worked on the Manhattan Project in 1940s America and who would give birth to the nuclear arms program. In the film, there is a scene in which Oppenheimer speaks Dutch, and that's what I'd like to talk about in today's video. Now, Oppenheimer was born in 1904 in New York and grew up in the United States. However, he would travel to Europe some 20 years later in 1924 to study at the University of Cambridge, as there was far more research going on into physics in Europe at that time than in the United States. 2 years later, in 1926, he would also go to the Netherlands, specifically to the University of Leiden. And he can actually be seen in this photograph taken of various professors and students at the University of Leiden from his time there in 1926. That same year, he would abandon the University of Cambridge, where he wasn't very happy, and go instead to Göttingen in Germany. But the flashback in the film seems to be from 2 years later, in 1928, when he actually went back to Leiden, but this time not to study, but rather to teach a series of lectures, which, to the shock of the audience, he gave in the Dutch language, which actually he had not been raised in, of course, but he had learned in a record of 6 weeks, if he is to be believed. Now, Oppenheimer was in fact a polymath, and so he was very well versed in many different fields of study, including in linguistics, as we'll get into later on in the video. And it said that his Dutch students would give Oppenheimer the nickname of Opje, which then later was anglicized by other students who caught wind of it to Oppie, and that then became his Dutch and English nicknames. Now, to go back to the film Oppenheimer, Cillian Murphy, who plays the role of the physics genius in the film, is said to have learned around 30,000 words of Dutch in preparation for the role, despite this being a really short little scene where he's speaking Dutch. So surely this must be a really, really good bit of Dutch that's spoken in the film. Well, let's take a listen. Now, if you don't speak Dutch, that may sound like gibberish, which is often what Dutch does sound like to people who don't speak it. But even if you do, the chances are that that still sounded like gibberish. Now, luckily, our friends from the history channel Geschiedenislesjes, a Dutch language history channel, are on hand to help with understanding what's actually being said.
Ook als je Nederlands spreekt, is nauwelijks te verstaan wat de man hier zegt. Maar ik was toch benieuwd, dus met het fragment op repeat en iets vertraagd heb ik er dit van kunnen maken.
As our friends from Geschiedenislesjes said, most Dutch people had no idea what was being said here and found it very difficult to understand, particularly saying that it sounded very German. So why was that the case? Well, we actually know a little bit about the process that Cillian Murphy used to learn these lines of Dutch, and that was that they used Heute van Hoytema to come in and to teach him some of these phrases by basically recording them and then sending them over, and that the actor then listened to these phrases slowed down to get the sounds, the pronunciations, and then remembered it and so said it for the film. But clearly, if he had done that, then his accent was either very strange or he hasn't done a particular job. Or was it intentional? The thing is that Oppenheimer actually did give a lecture series at Leiden in the Dutch language, and that the students that were there were able enough to understand him, even if his Dutch wasn't perfect. Now, there may be a historical basis for his Dutch sounding very German, and this is because his father was actually a German Jewish immigrant who had arrived in the USA in the 1880s and spoke German as a first language, speaking English rather poorly. Oppenheimer himself was fluent in the German language, and given how similar German and Dutch were, it makes sense that if he had a background in German, that would influence the way that he would learn Dutch, particularly if he learned it in such a short amount of time. As well as knowing Following German, Oppenheimer also studied various other languages over his career, including French, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. One of the consequences of his having studied Sanskrit is, of course, one of the most famous quotes that is attributed to Oppenheimer following the testing of one of the atomic bombs: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," which of course is from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the texts that is held to be holy by many Hindus and people of other faiths around the world, and that was written originally in the Sanskrit language. So maybe the very stilted Dutch that we hear Cillian Murphy actually speaking was intentionally selected, because this is probably quite accurate given that he'd only spent 6 weeks trying to learn the Dutch language to give this speech, and with his background in German, it makes sense that his Dutch therefore also sounds rather more like German. A fun comparison that I thought I'd add is this bit of audio clip that compares Queen Juliana, or the future Queen Juliana, who is a native Dutch speaker who married a German, Prince Bernhard, who is here heard speaking Dutch with a very strong German accent from 1936. And you can hear the difference in the phonemes, even though they are both speaking Dutch.
Ik ben heel gelukkig nadat wij elkander in de loop van dit jaar in alle stilte heel goed hebben leren kennen. Geleidelijk aan zijn wij het samen eens geworden, en wel zeer eens.
In de eerste plaats een woord van innige dank voor de hartelijke ontvangst welke mij in Nederland ten deel is gevallen. En ik hoop dat men mij rustig den tijd zal willen laten om mij hier in allerlei belangen in te werken.
So, did the producers of Oppenheimer just do a bad job with prepping Cillian Murphy? Is it his fault that he didn't learn his Dutch lines enough and those 30,000 Dutch words that he learned were wasted? Or was it intentional and meant to sound like Oppenheimer with his background in German and having studied in Germany, and therefore that influencing his Dutch and actually being really attentive to historical linguistic detail? Well, let me know in the comments below. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and indeed please do check out Geschiedenislesjes, which, as I said, is a channel available in Dutch that makes all sorts of videos about Dutch and other history in Dutch. Voor mijn Nederlandse kijkers, dan zou ik dat hoog aanraden. But anyway, thank you all very much for watching. In the meantime, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.